So, those that are familiar with the teachings, because of having listened to satsangs more than once, you'll notice and see that what's delivered is actually a framework that tries not to leave anything out. It's a holistic framework that explains suffering, and as a result of the explanation, highlights that suffering can, in theory, come to an end. And not only in theory, but it does in practice for people. So both in theory and in practice, suffering can come to an end. The conceptual framework tries to answer a lot of the questions, but not only answer questions, but primarily expose dynamics, describe dynamics. When dynamics are not understood, then certain dynamics that maybe don't make as much sense in light of an explanation will carry on as if they make sense. So if we don't see mechanics, let's say, if we don't see that something is happening because of a certain reason, then there's space for us to create our own reason as to why it's happening. And if we come to see that something is happening for a very specific reason, and that reason is different to the concept that we have, the idea we have about why it's happening, and if attention lands on that other reason for things to happen, and it sees it time and time again as actually being a more realistic explanation of why something is happening, then our previous idea, our previous explanation of why something happens has to fall away if it's no longer supported. And so what's put forward is a set of concepts. And I can't emphasize this more, that the concepts are pointers, and the pointers need to be followed, not believed. And the pointers are always pointing to our experience. So they're really saying, verify whatever is suggested for yourself based on your own investigation of your own daily life. So real change, real learning happens when it's a byproduct of what is experienced. If we draw conclusions based on what is experienced, then those conclusions are not merely conceptual. And so that means that we really need to put our attention on what is being experienced, what is happening on an experiential level. So it's encouraging a looking on the level of actuality or experience, rather than keeping the concepts in our head and imagining that we understand them. And so the great news is that this looking happens automatically if a little switch goes off in the head that says, oh, actually, the only job I have, which isn't even really my job, is to allow the concepts that have become part of my up-to-date conditioning to see what's happening in life. Really, if we want to be specific with dynamics, that might happen because I'm making it very clear that it's very important. Right? So I'm putting out new conditioning that hopefully becomes part of the up-to-date conditioning, and then attention automatically goes from the head into daily living onto the experience where the dynamics are actually happening, and then the dynamics can get seen. So it isn't even our doing. It's not something you have to do. It's something that will happen if I make the point strongly enough. And so because it's a conceptual framework, sometimes it's good to focus on particulars of the conceptual framework. And what I'd like to focus on to start with is these two different levels that pervade through the conceptual framework. There's the biological reaction and the psychological reaction. There is the flow of life and our attitude to the flow of life. There is the thinking mind and the working mind. There is pain and pleasure, peace and suffering. Now, these are the ones that go together. The flow of life and biological reactions, pleasure and pain, they're all on one level. They're all circumstantial. And the working mind on that level. On the other level, there is the thinking mind, it's the attitudinal level, the thinking mind, the psychological reactions, suffering. And if a distinction between these two levels isn't made, then what happens is they basically blend in and are seen as one. And if a distinction between these two levels doesn't happen, then clarity is very hard to be there. So why are these two levels so important to separate and to define conceptually, to create a conceptual distinction between these two levels that are part of life in general? And the reason is because what's being spoken about here is one very particular subject, and that subject is happiness in daily living. Happiness for the human being in daily living. And it turns out that happiness for the human being on a continuous, unbroken basis is available, but that happiness is available in a very particular form. Or we could say happiness is one thing in particular. Happiness turns out to be peace of mind, regardless of circumstance. Our idea of happiness is usually happiness through outcomes. Happiness will be there if I'm loved by the other. Happiness will be there if I have material gain. Happiness will be there when life looks a certain way, on a circumstantial level. That would mean happiness on the level of the flow of life. And that's the wrong idea about happiness. And if we look for happiness on that level, we'll never find it. Happiness is not to be found in the flow of life. Happiness is not to be found in pleasure or pain. It turns out that our happiness is to be found in our attitude to the flow of life. And what is our current attitude that creates unhappiness? The current attitude that creates unhappiness is the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcomes. And that attitude is a byproduct of deeply ingrained beliefs that are part of our up-to-date conditioning. Beliefs that were delivered based on the new conditioning that was that came to us in each moment in life. And the accumulation of the new conditioning in each moment is what we can call up-to-date conditioning. So our attitude that creates unhappiness is the attitude towards the flow of life that says, my happiness is to be found in the flow of life. And I am the doer and the other is the doer. And the attitude that delivers happiness is actually the absence, the falling away of the current attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. Now, if life put that attitude in place, it makes sense that that's how attitudes or beliefs get embedded, and it makes sense that that's how they'll get uprooted. It's life that puts everything in place, and it's life that brings about change. So on one level, on the level of the flow of life, we find ourselves in a circumstance, and based on the circumstance and our particular makeup at that point in time, there is a biological reaction that happens. Now, the biological reaction has nothing to do with happiness or unhappiness. The biological reaction is on the level of the flow of life. So if someone gives us some chocolate cake and we put it into our mouth, and then there is a biological reaction. And that biological reaction is either pleasurable or painful. You can't avoid the biological reaction. It's based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning and primarily the biological preferences that are in place. And even stretching out to pick up the piece of chocolate cake is a biological reaction. Everything that happens on the flow of life is a biological reaction. Our thinking, if it is the working mind thinking, functional thinking, is a biological reaction. So even though it's thinking, and normally we use the word psychological for thinking, in this case we're creating a distinction. Biological means those things that happen through the body, functions of the body that are part of the flow of life, and that includes thinking. Then there's a distinction between different types of thinking. The type of thinking that we will call suffering is not part of the biological movement of the body, it's part of the psychological movement, and it turns out that the psychological movement of the body is about an attitude to the biological, an attitude to the biological and the circumstance that's happening. So suffering is always attitudinal. That attitude to the flow of life does arise in the form of thoughts and feelings. So maybe we can start to see that there are these two levels. The biological, which can include thinking, like what will I buy at the grocery store is a thought, or where did I leave my bag is a thought. And that's part of the biological functioning of the human being in life. And the biological functioning is not our unhappiness, is not suffering. It's pleasure or pain. It's on the flow of life level. And it turns out that our suffering is a product of what we can call the thinking mind. The thinking mind is not biological but psychological. And the thinking mind at its root has these beliefs that life has put in place that create a certain attitude to what is happening. And the main attitude that causes problems is the attitude of personal doership. I am the doer and the other is the doer. And the accompanying attitude is, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes, in how life turns out. And as a result of those ingrained beliefs, suffering arises in the form of guilt, blame and pride, worry, and expectation and attachment to outcomes. And the guilt, blame and pride is about what I have done and how I've done it, what the other has done and how they did it. Guilt for those actions that happened through me that delivered a painful outcome to myself or someone I like or love, or even a stranger. And blame towards the other for what they have done that delivered pain to me or someone I love, or even a stranger. And pride is based on the same principle of seeing the other as the doer and seeing myself as the doer and looking at those actions that happen through me that are positive and then saying, look what I have achieved. So the idea that I'm a doer, really what it means is it's a way of interpreting. So doership doesn't mean what we do or don't do. So the idea of non-doership, if an understanding of non-doership sinks in, it doesn't mean we will stop functioning. It doesn't mean we will stop acting in life. Non-doership is our attitude to what is happening, to how we function. And similarly, the attitude of doership is an attitude to what is happening, to the functioning of the human being and the functioning of the other. So our behavior in life, our activity in life is possibly not going to change at all when the attitude changes from doership to non-doership. It's simply a way of interpreting or seeing what is happening. So the attitude of doership sees the person as an independent entity that creates of their own volition everything that they think, feel, say and do. And it sees the other as the same. And the attitude of non-doership is simply the dissolving of being able to see life like that. It simply doesn't make sense anymore. The reason it doesn't make sense anymore is because it used to make sense when the functioning of the human being wasn't seen for what it is. So when it's not seen for what it is, it makes sense that there's space for another story. I am in control of what I say in this moment, what I do in this moment. I have complete volition. So we have an idea of ourselves as some imagined entity inside that can consciously choose what to do and what not to do. And when we look for this entity, if we look inwards and we try and find this entity, what we'll end up finding is a conditioned instrument. The human body, which includes the brain, and we might start to see that all of the body functions automatically. It's a biological machine. The heart pumps, the liver filters, the spleen does spleening. I'm not sure what the spleen does. Some sort of filtering, I'm sure. And the brain processes. The brain is like the central processing unit that gets the rest of the body to function in a coordinated way based on what is sensed from the outside. And so what feels like my doing actually is an automatic response or reaction that had to happen that way based on the circumstance. And what throws us off here is the fact that it feels so much like my doing. A lot of what happens, well, actually not a lot of what happens through the human being, some of what happens through the human being feels like my doing. Some of the thinking and the speaking and the actions feel like my doing. There are times when things just come out. We say things that we don't mean to say. The body involuntarily, what we call involuntary movements, happen. Twitches and stumbles and all sorts of things that we don't intend to do, and they happen anyway. And so maybe even those functions that feel like they are my doing are automatic and involuntary. And if I was saying this in isolation to a specific benchmark, it might sound like, well, I don't think this sounds very good, or this is nonsense. But if we keep in mind this very important question, what am I really looking for in life? And maybe if we've come to see that the answer that is suggested here is not far off, in fact, maybe very accurate. What I'm really looking for is to be happy in life. And when I look at what my unhappiness in life is, it's a feeling that arises throughout the day because of my relationship, my attitude to circumstance. That feeling we can call suffering, and at its core it's an uncomfortableness with who we are. And it arises in those different forms: guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. So if we become clear that what I'm looking for is happiness, my unhappiness is a very specific set of feelings and thoughts. And when I look at those thoughts and feelings, that at the base is an uncomfortableness with oneself, and an uncomfortableness with the other, an uncomfortableness with life. We see that it's not biological, but attitudinal, meaning it's not circumstantial, but my attitude to circumstance. That's what the uncomfortableness is. The uncomfortableness on a level of self, we could say. What seems like an attack on who I am. And so if we come to this conclusion, then we might see, this is why it's worth looking and seeing whether I really am the doer and whether the other is the doer. And in fact, if I come to this conclusion, what I'm looking for is happiness, my unhappiness is suffering, and suffering arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, and the basis on which guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation arise is an underlying assumption that I'm the doer, the other's the doer, and my happiness is dependent on life looking a certain way. If we come to that conclusion, we would actually hope that when we investigate whether I really am the doer and the other is the doer, whether my happiness really is dependent on outcomes, we would hope that we find that the answer is no. No, I am not the doer, and no, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. The reason we would hope to find on investigation that that belief is incorrect is because if we didn't find that it's incorrect, if we found that it is correct, then it means the suffering that arises makes sense. The suffering that arises isn't based on an error, and therefore we'd have to conclude, we'd have to accept that suffering is an inevitable and unchanging part of life. Whereas if we check and we find, wow, this idea that I'm the doer is based on a very superficial assessment of what happens in each moment, and it's wrong. I can't run with it anymore. It was based on a superficial assessment, and my assessment has now gone deeper. My assessment has become more accurate, more detailed. And the basis of non-doership, the factors or the proof, the evidence that is being put forward here that says actually what you do in each moment is much less you're doing and much more are happening, points at the fact that the human being in each moment is one way, is designed very specifically to be one way in each moment, and that way, the way that they are, the shape of the human being, is based on two factors. And those two factors are two factors that we were never in control of. The genes and up-to-date conditioning. Now, genes and up-to-date conditioning really point to the complete makeup on a biological and psychological level of this human instrument. So that means the very complex neural networks, the blood vessels, the organs, and all of the beliefs that are contained in the system. Not only beliefs, but personality, preferences. So genes and up-to-date conditioning means the complete instrument through which consciousness functions. And it should be quite clear that, when we were conceived, we started growing. And who on earth had control over their growth, their physical growth? And that growing process, in principle, remains the same throughout our life. And how the growth happens is determined and influenced by the environment in which we find ourselves in. And so that's what we can call the conditioning that becomes one with the genetics. They're not two, really. They become the one human being. So actually, sometimes when people hear about this explanation of genes and up-to-date conditioning, they say, oh, this is an outdated explanation. Science has now found that the workings of the human being are much more complex to what was understood in the 60s or 70s when the notion of genes were put forward. Now, I contend that based on the explanation I've just put forward, genes and up-to-date conditioning is just a way of describing the complete human being. We don't need to know the specifics of genetic science. Scientists will understand the makeup of the human being more and more particularly, but they'll continue to find that those two factors are not something that we're in control of. We are a result of those two factors. On a biological and psychological level, we are a result. So it turns out that in the early stages, it was believed that genes were more or less unchanging. And nowadays, there's the notion of epigenetics. Epigenetics simply means that the genes do change, and they change as a result of the environment that they're exposed to. So what it's saying is that the genes and the up-to-date conditioning are not two. So the human being is a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning, and what it creates is the final not two product, the human being as it is in each moment. And so new conditioning will change who we are on a biological and psychological level. That's just inevitable. And that change could be, and is, I would guess, physiological. So even our belief system is represented by physiology in the brain. So when we stop believing in Santa Claus, there's going to be a corresponding shift in the makeup of the human being. Something has changed. So I would expect that there is a change on the level of the instrument. And where do you think this change takes place? When the belief in Santa Claus changes. I'd say it takes place in this amazing instrument, the brain. If we were to look at the brain under certain instrumentation, we see it's firing millions of times a second. And so a change in belief would be part of that movement in the brain. And so if we get new information, that information is processed and it becomes part of who we are. And we then function based on our design in that particular moment. So even if the functioning feels personal, feels like it's me doing it, it's a result of the instrument at any particular point in time, and that instrument is that way according to factors that we're not in control of. That's it. That's about as complex or simple as it gets. And the attitude of personal doership has an idea that is completely incompatible to what I've just described. So hearing this information is probably creating lots of movement in the brain. Anything creates lots of movement in the brain, but it makes sense that this information, new conditioning, will be changing our genes and up-to-date conditioning. How it changes our genes and up-to-date conditioning, not in your control, not in my control. The stuff going on in here when we're listening to things is not something that we're privy to. What seems to happen is that real long-lasting change happens not when we just hear something, but when we start to confirm based on observation. That's when the movements in the brain and the new connections are probably formed the most. So in the explanation put forward, we say that you start off with an intellectual understanding. That means something in the brain has changed. So if I ask someone tomorrow, hey, what's your intellectual understanding about non-doership? If they can repeat it, it means that things happened in the brain and it got locked in. If they can't repeat it, they go, I don't know, I was there, but frankly, I got no idea. So things must have been happening in the brain, but it might have been things related to sounds outside or related to your shopping list that you were thinking about. Or it might have been you were listening, but the way that things happened in the brain, it didn't lock the information in, which means it didn't create new patterning. But to have an intellectual understanding is one thing. What we find with just an intellectual understanding is it doesn't have the effect of changing the deeply ingrained beliefs. As we start to observe what is described for ourselves in daily life, really see it, then it seems like that is much more powerful at creating long-lasting new links in the genes and up-to-date conditioning. That's why at the beginning of today's session, I think it was today's session, there's a really important, fundamental movement that needs to happen, and that is for us to observe what is being pointed at for ourselves based on our own life experience. And as it's observed more and more, the changes go deeper and deeper, the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper, and it kicks out the misunderstanding. What it really might be saying here is that the old neural networks shift to new neural networks. So the deeper and deeper the understanding goes, the more of the old understanding, misunderstanding, that dissolves. Until one day we find ourselves functioning in life, living life, and finding that suffering no longer arises. Not because we're working very hard to ensure that suffering doesn't arise, but because life has changed us such that we are now designed a different way to before. So if it becomes clear that what I'm looking for is happiness, happiness turns out to be the end of suffering. I'm not the doer of whether this happiness comes or not. It's a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning that I'm not in control of. If that information gets locked in, it means we've changed. We're different to when that information was not part of our system. if that information is part of our system, it makes sense that when we go through life, attention can start landing on aspects of life that are relevant to this question of happiness. And as attention lands on aspects of life that are relevant to this question of happiness, that's new conditioning, that's experience presenting itself, and that experience and the observation of it, the awareness of it, is likely to make further changes. We can see that this movement that has been happening for at least the last 5,000 years, based on texts and images that are around today that talk about this subject in more or less the same way I'm talking about it now. Different words, but same principle. We could look at this movement as part of human evolution. And that the change, evolution is change. The change that happens through life gradually delivering, and when I say gradually, I mean on a humanity level. The change is very gradual. But for particular individuals, which make up, the cumulative population makes up humanity. And evolution is about a change in the whole of the population over a very long period of time. But that change happens little bit by little bit. And the little bit is where individuals change radically. And so one individual that changes radically has had a very small effect on the whole. So if one person changes in a way where they no longer function and suffering no longer arises, then out of the whole population, the overall evolution is minor. But for the one person that has changed, the evolution is quite drastic. And as that change happens, it makes sense that the intelligence of the whole, the intelligence of life, starts to function. So that human being will start talking about this new possibility, which becomes part of the agent of change. And we start seeing more and more individuals in the mass population changing. And as more and more change happens, the overall change starts to increase. And so this shift could well be the beginning. It's not the beginning, it's advanced, of a complete change that happens at some point. So I wouldn't be surprised that in the same way that we might look back on the evolution of the human and see versions of humans that now seem very distant to what we are. It wouldn't surprise me that in many years' time, humans will look back and see this period of history as being part of human evolution. Contrary to what is often put forward, and it's put forward for good reason, there's method to a teaching. Contrary to what's put forward is the change that happens on the level of the body-mind. So enlightenment is often said not to be something of the person, that the person doesn't get liberated. I say, and Ramesh used to say, the person is who gets liberated. The change, when we look at it, happens on the level of mind or brain. Liberation per se is not something. It's not a new functioning. It's not the addition. It's the falling away of suffering. The suffering is mind-made, brain-made, and the liberation is the liberation from the brain functioning a particular way. So the change happens on the level of the body-mind organism. The reason why a teaching says that enlightenment is not something that happens on the level of mind is simply to try and cut off the thinking mind that is convinced that if it's something that happens on the level of mind, I need to do it. So the teachings that say it's not something that happens on the level of the mind, you can't think your way into freedom, is pointing at the movement of the doer, the thinking mind, that when that is moving, it's a reinforcing of the existing patterns, the existing genes and up-to-date conditioning. It's a reinforcing of the idea, I am the doer, I will make this happen, I have to make life happen. I do make life happen. And so if that's the functioning, a teaching will say, stop. You can't think your way out of a problem that exists on the level of the mind. But actually that teaching that is saying it's not a functioning of the mind is talking to the mind. Any teaching, even a teaching that says it's not a teaching, is talking to the mind, the brain. The only thing that hears a teaching is the brain. So if a teaching says, stop thinking, in order for the brain to stop thinking, if that's going to happen, it's because the brain gets reconditioned to, in certain instances, stop thinking. So an instruction that says, I'm not talking to the mind, is actually talking to the mind. I don't have a problem with an instruction that says, I'm not talking to the mind. It's doing it for a good reason. But what I'm pointing out is that actually all change happens on the level of mind first. When I say mind, I really mean brain and mind as not two. we've got a lot of beliefs about all sorts of things. And some of the beliefs are the beliefs that have been put in place based on our relationship with teachings. And it's great to have them exposed. If we come to understand why teachings do something, then we can realize, wow, it was telling me something that isn't necessarily the truth, very valuable, very useful, but now I can go past it now that I understand why it was doing that. And so even non-duality, which is what I would say that this topic actually falls into, what I'm sharing, would still fall into the category of non-duality. But if we hold on to the idea of non-duality as being some ultimate truth, and that that's the reason why happiness is available, the subject is called non-duality. So that has to be the reason, the realization, the saving grace. It's a methodology to bring about shifts. Non-duality, as I see it, that's what I have trouble with the terminology now, is not some ultimate truth that is realized, and the freedom lies because of the realization of non-duality. A realization of oneness from a particular perspective, and that you can sort of see lots of different explanations of what oneness and non-duality is pointing at. There is interconnectivity, there is the perspective that sees everything as a single experience, life as a single experience. You have the perspective that is there is one consciousness functioning through all of us. And so ultimately at our core we are all one and not separate from that consciousness. So there are a lot of interpretations of what oneness and non-duality and non-separation mean. In this teaching, the non-separation turns out to be, or the separation turns out to be the idea I am the doer that creates me and the other as doers and creates a sense of competition and rivalry, anonymity, and creates an attitude that disturbs the peace. So the separation in this particular teaching is talking about an attitudinal separation. And when the attitude of doership falls away, what we find is that we're all moving in each moment like the crest of a wave. The movement in each moment of everyone and circumstance is a happening. And there is no attitude that's creating a separation between me and the other. Can you pass the microphone back?
Okay, I want to get this so badly. So any resistance that I'm putting out is just my desire to absorb this more deeply. I don't know if this is a Western thing or an American thing, but it feels like to accept my conditioning on some level feels irresponsible still for me. I see on one level acceptance to my conditioning at this point is the only entryway. On another level, I feel like it's irresponsible, and that's the Tony Robbins or the self-help movement, in terms of I have the power to change. And I know this is like so rudimentary, and I apologize for this, but I was just, while you were speaking, I was thinking the time in life when we're children and we don't have the consciousness to change our conditioning, we're literally being conditioned. There's almost like an anger at the circumstances that created so much suffering as a child, like, because there's nothing I could do about that. Then the anger goes from the circumstances to myself when there's a period in life where I know better. Like, it's okay, there's the early part in life where we're being conditioned and we don't have control. And so there's some anger at that, like, why did this happen to me? A victim mentality. Then there's a period in life where I begin to have consciousness and awareness, and I begin to consciously change my conditioning, saying, this doesn't work, this is now changing. Now I have anger towards myself for not choosing better. And now there's like this third segment where there's more like a despair or grief or powerlessness that I can't necessarily upgrade to the level that I want to. Does this make sense? So it's like from non-conscious awareness of conditioning to having conscious awareness to now being aware but not being able to change it.
So what you said makes sense, but it's your story of how things work.
Totally.
Yeah. It's inaccurate.
Awesome. Please tell me.
So I'm not asking anyone to accept that you can't control how you function and how the other functions. I'm just putting forward a description that when it's looked at rationally and objectively is hard to be faulted. And so if someone says, but I don't like that description, right? And it seems irresponsible for me to accept that description. It sounds as though this is optional. It's like, well, this is just a description of dynamics. It's not like, oh, I can have this description or another description and choose which one sounds nicest. It's like, do you want to know the description that is an objective description from a particular perspective of how things is?
But Roger, in American culture, it's like we shouldn't accept that we can change.
The whole world is unhappy. Right?
But we shouldn't accept what we can change. So like that, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, the wisdom to know the difference.
Yeah, so that is integrated wisdom, right? So that comes after we first see the basic way it is, and then the paradox can build on that. So the paradox is, I'm not the doer, and yet in each moment I am the one that has to function. Right? The paradox is, I'm not in control of change, and yet the very nature of life is change. And so where the type of sayings that talk about the paradox or the different the capacity to make change, let's say, it's there so that our beliefs don't create a complacency, don't create a new block that is a belief, oh, I can't control anything that happens. And so if that becomes a strong belief, then there's a tendency for someone to become depressed or fall into despair. So then the teaching needs to create a correction of that movement. If we don't at first lay out the foundation that shows ultimately we're not the doers, and yet life happens through us and change happens, and so even though I'm not the doer, change will continue to happen. So that's why those teachings, those sayings are there, so that we don't end up only looking at one side of the paradox. By default, a paradox has two sides at least. So we're not the doers, and yet we have to function in each moment as if we're the doer.
I liked so much this description of the change in the neural network on the biological level, liberation happening in the body-mind system. And when you were talking about the making the difference between pain, pleasure, suffering, and all these the split up, I could see that when this intelligence of life, which is operating through all body minds, it needs somehow an orientation through awareness, through the personal awareness, how to stop the different aspects in the brain to function in this way and to reprogram them to function in the new way. So, and I got it that a belief is mostly a stalemate for this process. That's why you are so much pointing out when the belief that when the mode in the brain is in the belief mode, it can't just land on. It just can't land on because it's like I could see it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I like it very much.
Yeah. And actually, you'll see that if I describe it the way I did today, what happens is you don't end up getting the conceptual information, in a way. The model as it's normally put forward gives the conceptual distinctions that are required for the changes to happen. So it's new conditioning. And so that new conditioning is specifically designed to be delivered in a way that brings about the changes.
Yes.
Right? So certain explanations, so the explanation I gave today is not what I'll normally put forward. It's great to have it as a secondary explanation. But in order for those changes to happen, the information needs to be delivered so in conceptual form that creates conceptual distinctions so that the whole landscape can be understood conceptually and then seen according to those concepts. And then at some point, that conceptual framework is seen to be actually just a rudimentary explanation, and it can be dropped.
Yeah.
So if we describe the functioning of the changes in the neural network, right, that's describing the changes that happen, but it's not providing the information on which the changes happen.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why breaking it down into something like genes and up-to-date conditioning, even though the two are not separate. Breaking it into the working mind and the thinking mind, even though there is just one brain. Creates the information, provides the information. The information is simply new conditioning. It's sort of like hits that create change.
Yes, and here it is experienced when this information is delivered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. If we want to go back to your question, which is saying, so it's hard to accept. What you might find is it's hard to accept because it seems to be a challenge on the deeply ingrained beliefs. In practice, if we actually see what is being described, and if seeing what's being described has the required effects, what ends up being delivered in practice is something radically different to what the thinking mind imagines when it hears this. So the thinking mind hears this and it says, this is terrible news. I simply can't accept this. Accepting it is terrible. Because it creates an idea of what this actually means. And so that idea is based on the best it can work out. And what we're told over and over again is that surrender delivers an amazing output, not the output we imagine it will deliver. That this shift is not at all what we imagined. So at some point, if we have this rule that suffering arises from misunderstanding, so in Buddhism it's referred to as ignorance, right? Not meant to be personal or an attack on the individual, it's just the word that's used, ignorance, stupidity really, I guess, not personal stupidity, but an error. And the shift that happens in Buddhism is described as understanding, clarity. So from ignorance to understanding. And so if we find that we're suffering, it's actually grace for us to realize my suffering comes from error, from ignorance, from misunderstanding life, not seeing it clearly. And so we might say, on that basis, why am I so sure about the conclusions that I form? It makes sense that the conclusions that come out of that ignorance might be ignorant. And so if we come to this, I speak from personal experience, it was a saving grace a lot of the time when I was stubbornly arguing something, is there was a recognition, if there is suffering arising, it's because life isn't seen clearly. So if I'm arguing, especially against often Ramesh, who I trusted, had no suffering in his life, which to me was a sign of understanding. When I'd find myself locked in intellectual debate, not necessarily with him in person, but in my mind, supporting my belief systems, then the thought would arise, actually you don't really know, there's a good chance that this is part of the misunderstanding from which the suffering that is part of your life experience arises. And that used to create a surrender. It was like a recognition, oh, I'm probably pushing my own ignorance.
I definitely don't know. I'm suffering way too much for someone who knows. And I'm resisting only because I want to be able to soften my resistance.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I've been fighting my whole life. Not arguing, fighting, but fighting. And we've all experienced injustice. And if that injustice has been happening since we're small children, regardless of how our lives look from the outside, there's so much doing, because from such a young age, there's a sense of trying to survive. So I think what's happening to me in this time with you, Roger, is this survivor in me does not know what to do, because she's been working so hard to like save me for over 3 decades. She's been trying to save me, and she's been trying to save me through a spiritual process, you know, through doing the right thing. So she doesn't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a part, I mean, I really thought I'd given up all my childhood issues a long time ago, but there's that anger that I, that like, as a kid, like watching all these children be supported by their parents or by their families, to save myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's the one who's confused because she's worked really hard for so long. And she's exhausted. And she would like to stop. But to stop means to die for her.
Mm-hmm. Well, die in that role, yeah. So, if I were to say anything to her, I'd say she's off duty. Yeah, she's served her time, and now she's been discharged. If you look at what's happening is that we have the flow of life, which is pleasure or pain. And then there is our attitude to the flow of life. And that attitude is one of resistance because it's not how we would like it to be. Right? So there's a resistance, an attitude to the pain in the moment, or the circumstance in the moment. And then that resistance feels uncomfortable, and then we resist the uncomfortableness. So it's always an attitude. So the first attitude of suffering is the attitude to pleasure or pain. That's the primary suffering. Resistance, in the case you described of a childhood where you weren't getting a lot of attention, let's say. So that's pain in the moment. And then there is a resisting of the pain in the moment. And then that resisting feels uncomfortable. And then there's a resisting of the uncomfortableness. And on it goes. And so if we can understand that the what was being locked away in childhood is essentially the uncomfortableness of the resistance to pain. The attitude to pain was the suffering, and that is being locked away. And what gets locked away energetically, essentially, is a belief that my happiness is to be found in outcome, because it was that relationship that the child had, that they couldn't have had it differently. They couldn't be different. They looked at pain in the moment as an attack on who they are. It was an attack on their self-image.
But it actually was. It's not just like I wasn't getting attention when there's shaming and abuse when you're a child. You fundamentally know it's not right somewhere inside of you, so you begin to fight.
Yeah, but actually, when you look at it, it's it's abuse on a biological level. It's someone's concept, right, and someone's way of behaving. That if that happens to us when we're older, and let's say grounded in our sense of self, that behavior towards me is not an attack on who I am. It's just circumstance. And in theory, if a child was grounded in who they are, it would just be circumstance. Right? The fact is, we know that at an early age, and even frankly at an old age, the attitude at a young age and an old age is usually one of doership and attachment to outcome. So at an old age, or mid-age, whatever, we're going to receive that behavior from others as an attack on who we are, just like the child did. Unless something has radically changed inside of us and those beliefs are no longer there.
Roger, as children, I'm really sorry, but as children, our brains are forming, and we also don't often have another voice in our life to reflect reality back to us.
Exactly. So what happened is completely understandable. I'm not suggesting it should have been any other way. The fact is that even adults haven't been grown to a point where they can rationalize painful situations as just pain. So the child has problems because it's understandable, and adults have problems because actually the attitude hasn't changed radically from childhood to mid-age or old age. Right? So what I'm putting forward is that if we look at it rationally, which we tend not to be able to do as humans, right? But if we look at it rationally, we see that a painful situation is actually an attack on the biological level. If we're grounded in a connection to what we are at our core, only if we are grounded, they will realize what happens in the flow of life doesn't touch who I am in this moment at my core. So cancer, if I am diagnosed with cancer that is eating away at my body, the core of my being is untouched by that. Right? And if I'm enslaved and I'm being mistreated, the core of my being is untouched if the attitude is a certain way. If the attitude isn't that way, we're going to feel completely attacked by the cancer, completely attacked by the maltreatment. It makes complete sense to me why we're feeling completely attacked, because instead of having a connection to the core of who we are, there's a self-image based on a whole lot of beliefs. And those beliefs are interacting with the circumstance. So I guess what I like to try and highlight is that the child was exposed to pain in the moment. And the attitude to pain in the moment was of attachment to pleasure, resistance on a psychological level to pain. And that's the first level of uncomfortableness that's felt. The child then feels, one, the pain, that's because of the circumstance, and then the uncomfortableness. And that uncomfortableness is not acceptable, just like the pain wasn't acceptable. And so then there's a fight against the pain and the uncomfortableness. And that creates more uncomfortableness, which is not acceptable. And so the experience in life is highly uncomfortable. And so the biology tries to fix this. And the way it can fix it is by suppressing, by creating distractions. And so those attitudes to pain and then the attitudes to the suffering get locked away in these energies. And those, it's not really a fix, because what happens is it gets locked in the body, and then our filter through which we see life is the filter that was locked away when we experienced painful situations when we were young.
The child in me felt shame, and that shame, no matter how conscious I am of it, like when I'm talking on the mic and someone gets up, I still am flooded with shame. Not because I need attention, but because I feel like I'm doing something wrong. Like me talking right now is doing something wrong to other people in the room. It's upsetting other people in the room. It's bothering other people in the room. Like, this is like the shame that, I mean, it's embarrassing to admit this being. That my existence hurts people, upsets people.
So you've hit the nail on the head, that there is a sense of unworthiness, and that unworthiness is based on an interpretation of why things are happening. If someone's getting upset, it's actually because of them, right? And we interpret it as being personal. So the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome is ultimately attached to love from the other, because deep down, what is in place is a sense that I am not worthy of love. And that unworthiness is shame. And as we've spoken about, that the shame on a very deep level might come from the sense that we were thrown out of home, thrown out of God. So what we've spoken about as being what could be referred to as the original sin. And sin means error, so the original error, which is something we come into this life with, is the idea that I have been thrown out because I'm not worthy. And so at the very, very core of our uncomfortableness is a sense of shame and unworthiness.
Here's the part I'm getting, and then I'll shut up. It is that I think on a core level, I know that I am worthy. I know that every human being is worthy. And that's why I've been working so hard. And this is probably why myself and thousands of people flood the entertainment industry, is because on some core level, we know we are worthy and we're waiting for someone to recognize it and mirror back the worthiness.
See, but that isn't knowing you're worthy, what you just said. That the urge to do that is from the I'm not sure I'm worthy, and if I can prove to the world by doing something amazing, then people will tell me I'm worthy. Right? To know you're worthy is to not need to do anything.
But if you know you're worthy, but you don't know how to actually live, it's like I'm worthy, but I feel trapped in a prison that I don't know how to escape, and this will somehow unlock the door of the prison. Because when someone says, you don't believe in lovable, I think I went through, I did for that, but now I don't believe that's true for myself or anybody.
Mm-hmm. You see, but I agree on a conscious level. There's the openness. There's an opening that says, actually, this idea that I'm unworthy is an error. But it's on a level that hasn't penetrated to the depths. There's two beliefs in the system that I am worthy and I don't need to prove anything to anyone. My very existence is my worth. And on another level, there's the old unworthiness. So in the system, there's both. And until that understanding goes deep and deep and deep and completely uproots the beliefs that say I'm not worthy, which are not something, if someone asks you, do you think you're worthy? You'll go, yes, I think I'm worthy, because you're answering from the your conscious understanding. But if someone yells at you, you'll collapse into a state of unworthiness. But you said it, if someone gets up, it creates a sense of unworthiness.
I feel that I've done something wrong, but I don't feel that I'm unworthy as a human being. I just feel like I can't get it right.
Okay, so let's
in
just...
relationship to other people. I don't feel unworthy as a human being.
Okay, but so, because this helps people, unworthiness means I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough is linked to guilt. I failed. I'm not performing well enough in this situation. So this unworthiness and feeling that I'm not doing well enough here are linked. So I put these forward to try and allow awareness and the working mind to see dynamics that are in place.
This is the anger. This is the doership. This is the anger that I don't want anyone to see. It's like, why can't they see that I'm good? Why can't they see? And this is a very child voice. This is not like my adult that function in the world. Or it is maybe. It's like, why can't they see that I am good? And that's the doer. It's like, I need them, not necessarily people here, but I need them in quotations to see that I am good. This is a very self-absorbed way of living life. We see this, but yet it's there. I need them to see that I'm good.
But can you see that if you're in that, you're acknowledging you're good, right? In that.
Myself and all beings.
Yeah. And then you're saying, and I need people to see that I'm good.
Yes, because if they don't, then there's conflict. How can I? There feels like there's conflict.
And so my point is that that's not really seeing that you're good. And I'm only saying this because I'm interested in these dynamics falling away, right? If we really realize that we're good, so I know I'm good regardless of what anyone else says or thinks. That's to know you're complete.
It feels, Roger, like you're in a courtroom, or I'm in a courtroom, and it's like life has been like you're on the witness stand, and you're pleading that you're not guilty, but
Do you want to know when you really know that you're not guilty? You don't even need to plead not guilty. So when Jesus was put in front of, we run with the Jesus story, he was put in front of the court and asked to explain himself. When asked, you have been accused of claiming to be the king of the Jews, I think it was. That's blasphemy. So explain yourself. And in my interpretation of this, there was an understanding that no matter what I say, that his understanding of himself, the understanding that I am the king of the Jews, right? What he meant, he didn't mean what it was interpreted as, what it was understood as. Right? So he didn't even need to defend himself. He remained silent, understanding that there's nothing he could say that would actually not explain, but be understood by those listening. And furthermore, by entering a plea of not guilty, you actually buy into the accusation. When you know that you are complete, any accusation is simply a story that doesn't need to be acknowledged.
And I guess the only difference with Jesus is that he had his most loving father who like restored him to sanity, whereas I feel like we're like childless orphans on the planet.
You see, Jesus was, in saying, I am the Son of God, what he was saying is we are all the sons and daughters of God. Right? Yeah. But all he was describing is the nature of the human being, impersonal consciousness of source, linked to a particular body-mind organism, an instrument, and functioning through that instrument as personal consciousness. Having realized his impersonal core, and recognizing that that core is the same core that functions in all human beings. When he was speaking for himself, he was speaking for all human beings. And so calling himself the Son of God, meaning the expression of Source, the one Source functioning through a unique instrument as personal consciousness. So that personal consciousness is the expression of the one Source, the Son, the offspring. Right? And so there's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The Trinity that is three but not three. The Trinity is three but one. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So source at rest. And the Son is source linked to a particular body-mind organism, spirit, in going from source at rest, and impersonal consciousness is the spirit of source at rest, or source at rest in movement, spirit, consciousness, linked to a particular body-mind and functioning through that as personal consciousness. So it's seeing that unchanging perfection that is at the root of the human being, and seeing all of the character as being the clothing, the instrument through which life is experienced, and not allowing the characteristics, the personality that has its flaws and its uniqueness to obscure our recognition of the core. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I just have a question about, like, you say that we have to function in every moment as if we are the doer. And yeah, like, because life is experienced as if we are the doer. And yeah, I just have like thoughts on like attaining new skills. Because when you learn something, you are obviously you're functioning as the doer, because you have like, you think, okay, I want to learn this, and then you like make efforts to learn it. And what I'm wondering is like, should we train our minds? Should we like make conscious efforts to like train our minds? For me, I'm experiencing that a lot of the time my mind is just like wandering. And I have been told that it's possible to like change this through training your mind, concentration. And now when I'm here with this like non-doership teachings, I feel like, well, another way is to just let go and like accept maybe mind drifting, but like try to recognize that I'm not the doer and just find peace that way. But still I'm like, or because even if I do train my mind, it's not really my doing, you know, it's just happening. So I'm like, should I make conscious efforts to train my mind, or should I just let it go?
Okay, so it's a great question, and it's important because if we just focus on non-doership, and everyone just hears non-doership, and I'm not the doer, then we miss the fact that in each moment we are designed a certain way and we function. We, know how to make fried eggs in the morning, and we know how to fill in our taxes, and some people are talented at singing and performing, and other people are great at other things. So non-doership is simply an attitude to what is happening. It doesn't change the fact that in each moment we are shaped a particular way to function a particular way. And how do we get shaped? We get shaped by new conditioning coming in each and every moment. And so if we surrender, let's say, if surrender happens to the fact I'm not the doer, it's a result of your mind being trained, essentially, by life, by new conditioning entering that has highlighted why you're not the doer, right? And similarly, if you were to surrender it to not being the doer, and a friend said, would you like to join me? I'm going to an Indian cooking class. Right? It's great value. We spend the whole morning cooking, and then we get to have lunch, eating what we've cooked. And so having surrendered to the idea, you're not the doer, you still are there in a physical form, you'll still have your preferences, and you'll still have to face circumstance. And so in that moment when your friend says, do you want to join me? You will find that life functions through you as if you are the doer, meaning that a yes or a no comes out. And that yes or no is based on your makeup in that particular point in time. And so let's say it's a yes. And let's say destiny, life, allows you to get to the cooking class, and you learn about all sorts of different spices and how to mix things and how to make the dough for certain breads. And at the end of it, you eat a great lunch. And so life, not you, has now trained you to be different to what you were before. You're now more capable of producing a meal that you previously might not have been capable of doing. So life brought about the training to the extent that you say, should I train myself? There's a good chance that the doership belief is still in that. Like, what you might say is, could life continue to train me in ways, for example, of mind concentration? And the answer is, of course it could. It could put in front of you a poster for a mind concentration workshop. which you might find yourself saying yes or no to. And if you find yourself saying yes to it, it's based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance you find yourself in. You might go to a mind concentration workshop and it might be rubbish. Right? Or you go and it provides some very useful techniques that allow you to function differently. A lot of the training, if there's the possibility of self-improvement on a biological level, right? So you figure, oh, I'm not very strong and I'm going to go to the gym. Then that self-improvement on a biological level can happen. We can improve ourselves on a biological level as much as we like, and it won't affect our happiness. Our happiness is going to be affected when our attitude to life changes. So as long as it becomes clear that my happiness is to be found not in the circumstance, but in my attitude to circumstance. So if life trains me attitudinally, then it makes sense that, and what I mean by train is it dissolves the previous attitude of doership and attachment to outcomes. If life is training me biologically, it means that our life on a circumstantial level is going to be different, maybe better, maybe more pleasure. And so primarily I would be focused on the attitudinal change, but if there's space for you to improve yourself biologically as well, it makes sense.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying is that I should like focus on dissolving the beliefs in doership.
No. I'm saying that life will do everything.
Well, then it's kind of to let go, isn't it, though?
Why not?
Yeah.
If you let go of the idea I'm the doer, life will continue to function as it's always functioned. You'll continue to be trained as you've always been trained. And you are off duty.
Yeah, because right now I feel like I'm a little bit like, I'm in, I'm still obviously having some belief in doership, and I'm like feeling that I need to, focus, like, and I need to do effort. I need to like do work, I need to work for it.
Yeah.
And
so everyone here has been being changed while sitting here, right? No one's had to do anything particular. Life has delivered conditioning, and that conditioning is changing us. In each moment we're being changed. So the recognition is that in this moment I have been shaped by life, and in the next moment I will have been shaped by life. And so you don't need to control how life shapes you. You can't control how life shapes you. So on an attitudinal level, you go, oh, I surrender. And yet you'll continue to be shaped by life, and you'll continue to function according to your shaping. And the thoughts happening, if the thoughts are continually happening, as long as they are witnessed as part of your biological and psychological makeup, then there's no need for them to change. It's the witnessing of them as a happening that means that there's peace with them. And if you witness them as something that you are doing and you need to train yourself to stop doing that, then that's going to be a resistance to the thoughts being there. If you can see them as a happening and be at peace with them, and at the same time you then find a poster that says, here's some tips about mental concentration. Once you've relaxed into the fact that they're not your doing, they're just part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and you allow them to be there, there's no reason why you might not take part in the workshop and find that your thoughts quieten down, which means that there's a different biological movement, and your attitude remains the same, one of witnessing, but the experience might be more pleasurable. more concentrated.
I have another question, and that is like physical pain. Yeah, I find it very hard, like, not to suffer when there is physical pain. Is it possible?
It depends what you mean by suffering, right? Because physical pain is always going to be painful.
Yeah.
And that is not attitudinal, that's biological. That's based on your biological preferences. And so the idea that pain is a concept, to me, doesn't make sense. Pain is actually part of the experience based on the biology of the human being and the circumstance. And so if you have a headache, it is painful. If you're clear using the word suffering, and you don't mean the pain of the headache, but your attitude to the pain of the headache. And you find that when there is the pain of the headache, you find it very hard to be at peace with the pain. You are resisting the pain. You're saying, why is this happening to me? I don't want this to be here. This is disturbing what I'm doing during the day. Right? All of that is suffering. And that suffering is an additional load on top of the pain that is there. The suffering doesn't help the situation. It adds a whole new level of suffering, uncomfortableness, on top of the pain. If the suffering did fall away because the attitude changes, and it's understood that if pain is there, it's there because it's destined in this moment to be there. Destined according to the story of life, the creation of life. It's not my doing, and it's there. Right? Just like clouds. If the clouds are covering the sun, and you're waiting for your clothes to dry, the fact is it's destiny in that moment for there to be no sun and for your clothes to take longer to dry. And in the same way, if there's a headache, it's there because it's destined to be there, not your doing. And if that understanding is there and the suffering is seen to be pointless, just like if you're suffering at the fact that there are clouds in front of the sun, and saying, why are you there? You shouldn't be there. This is not acceptable. Life is not meant to be this way. Then you have the pain of your clothes being wet for longer, and this added load of suffering, of the uncomfortableness with the pain in the situation. If the attitude falls away and the suffering falls away, what we find is the pain on its own is actually very manageable, very acceptable. And what is most uncomfortable on a level of on a level of self is the suffering and not the pain. So these distinctions, conceptual distinctions of the pain versus the attitude to the pain, can help us to see the difference. And then the explanation that says, well, your attitude to pain is really fighting what is. Fighting a situation that you didn't create, a situation that is just part of destiny.
So we have to accept that, like, pain might be part of our destiny, like physical
You
pain.
can't accept it. What will happen is suffering will arise if your genes and up-to-date conditioning don't see that it's just a happening. So suffering will arise if your genes and up-to-date conditioning are designed not to see it as a happening, and suffering won't arise if your genes and up-to-date conditioning are such that it's very clear that your resistance of the pain is not going to change the pain. Your resistance of the pain is actually going to make the situation, the experience much worse. And if your genes and up-to-date conditioning deeply understand that pain doesn't even come close to touching who I am at my core. Even with a headache, I exist. No doubt, the experience of the moment is not pleasurable, but I exist. If your genes and up-to-date conditioning are like that, then suffering won't arise. So acceptance is not something you do. Acceptance is the absence of non-acceptance.
Is there a meaning to life?
That's actually a very good question. Is there a meaning?
You can put whatever meaning you like on life. Right? If you create expectation out of your meaning, then it's likely that there's going to be suffering, because that expectation may or may not get met. So I would say the meaning of life, based on my experience, is to be. To be really means to function as the human being without attachment to outcomes and without seeing yourself as the doer and the other as the doer. And the reason I say that that is the meaning of life is because when that happens, which is not your doing, it's just life unfolding, when life affects the human being in such a way that they function that way, seeking stops. Seeking stops because uncomfortableness stops. And when the uncomfortableness stops and the seeking stops, it to me means that the goal has been met. Because when the goal hasn't been met, what we find is seeking. And so if seeking stops, we need to look at what is here that has brought about the end of seeking. And what we find is that the end of seeking happens not when a particular circumstance is a certain way, not when you are producing something wonderful or contributing to life. Peace and the end of seeking happens when there is a simple acceptance of life being exactly the way it is in that moment. So you might find yourself totally incapacitated because you've had an accident or old age, or just because you don't feel like doing anything else. So you find yourself actually being a fairly non-contributing member of society. That's a possibility. And the contentment and peace can still be there. So we find that the contentment and peace is not because we're doing something particular. And similarly, you might find yourself a very productive member of society, and the peace can still be there. We might find ourselves oscillating between the two, being productive, and then at some point that productivity comes to an end, and we find ourselves being what society might call lazy. Whereas for the person at peace, if someone says, "You're so lazy," you go, "What? I'm completely dedicated to enjoying life right now. I do this better than anyone else. How can you call me lazy?"
That's very different than like smoking weed all day. Or I mean, like there's an involvement versus like numbing.
Sure.
Doesn't that make you incompetent?
If I'm sitting on a couch.
I mean, I'm saying you, but I'm not referring to you, as in just using a second person pronoun.
Okay, so just for the sake of the thing, doesn't it make you incompetent if you are doing or if you are just being?
Yeah.
I guess I would be incompetent relative to some benchmarks, which are mind-made benchmarks. So if I'm just allowing life to unfold, enjoying life, meaning at peace with life, and someone has a benchmark that says, you should have a family, and let's say I haven't had a family. Someone would say, based on their benchmark, that the purpose of life is to have a family, they would call me incompetent. My peace, thankfully, would mean I wouldn't believe them.
And what about the cost you put on society if you're not contributing? Is there nothing ethical? Like, is there no right and wrongs?
Well, remember what I'm talking about is a functioning, and I'm particularly pointing at the attitudinal functioning, right? So I'm talking about someone who finds themselves at peace with themselves being exactly as they are, which means they find themselves at peace with everyone else being exactly the way they are. And frankly, it's the best contribution you could make to society.
Cool.
The other way of contributing or of being in society is someone who produces a lot, and if they don't have this attitude, will judge everyone else who doesn't produce as much as them, which is essentially attacking and being cruel to others. They will find themselves being judgmental of themselves whenever they find themselves incapable of producing at the standard that they have set for themselves. And that is the attitude of doership and attachment, which creates an attitude of rivalry, anonymity, judgment, and greed. And it's on that basis that life on a circumstantial level is a little bit messed up, on the basis that people are functioning from this place of doership and attachment to outcome. It creates wars between superficial differences, or as a result of seeing superficial differences as significant. And essentially it's based on not accepting life and the other as they are.
You also shouldn't judge others for doing.
No, not at all. It's not their doing. So the existence of the ego, or not ego, but the existence of this doership, if seen from a place of understanding and clarity, will bring about empathy and compassion, if anything. In its basic form, empathy and compassion simply means not buying into the story that that person has about themselves and the other. So yes, it's completely seen as impersonal, not their doing, but a happening that has to happen that way.
And it does feel like this teaching has to be very careful, though, because like it can be used to, because I've experienced this with many people in my life where they use it to like sit and smoke pot all day, or like just doing nothing, man. Like this is what I understand from you or from Eckhart Tolle or whomever, is just that what you're talking about is actually a very intense involvement. It's actually like a very, it's an aliveness. It's not a peace out, zoned out necessarily state of being. It's an engagement, but just a stillness, but an engagement.
Yes. Non-attachment doesn't mean non-participation. It means to participate as fully as we are designed to participate, with an attitude of witnessing life as a happening, knowing the outcome is not in our control, without that turning into, without that making us complacent or irresponsible. So it's a very fine line, which is why the teaching goes to great lengths to create concepts that fit into a holistic framework, that when the holistic framework is understood, when people ask questions like this and the answers are delivered, which is part of the framework, it continues to narrow us down onto a very fine line, which is that fine line that is not based on a belief that the doership has grabbed hold of. It will continue to highlight any occasions when the belief in doership and attachment sneaks in the back door. And one of the ways it does that is to say that one of the beacons that we need to follow, be aware of, is the beacon of peace and the beacon of suffering. When suffering is there, it's just an indication that something has gone wrong, not ultimately gone wrong, but attitudinally something isn't being seen clearly. And so whenever suffering is recognized, then we can become an expert. When the pointers allow us to start feeling on a level of what's actually happening, the different forms of suffering, the guilt, the blame, the pride, the worry and expectation. Once we start to become familiar with what that feels like, whenever it pops up in life, it's like, ooh, awareness lands on it. This is suffering in the moment. And then the thought might arise, suffering means something in my attitude is not quite right. And then we look at that suffering and we see it's arising in the form of blame for what the other has done. The other said that they would come on holiday with me, and a day before we're due to leave, they cancelled. And that uncomfortableness will get picked up by the working mind and awareness, and an inquiry into what has gone wrong. And so if the non-doership is taken on as a belief, and we find ourselves essentially covering up misunderstanding, using the idea, well, it's all just destined. I don't have to do anything, I'll just wait here till something comes along. Or even if we find ourselves stealing, and then the concept says, well, it was destined for me to steal, and it was destined for that person to have things taken away from them. Actually, it's true from an outside perspective, but that might be just being used as a justification to carry on a need for more. And if it is being used to carry on a need for more, then it's not going to create peace. There's still going to be the underlying suffering that's going to arise. The person might try to justify their situations with the concept, but it won't undo the suffering that is inevitable. And so at some point, if the concepts have settled in deeply enough, that suffering that remains will get registered. And then an inquiry will happen, and the person might realize, actually, I'm kidding myself. I'm just using this concept as an excuse to maintain a belief in attachment to outcome. And when that's seen, if the earnestness is there, the earnestness that says, actually, what I really am looking for is the end of suffering, then that little loophole that has been created based on the concept being taken not as intended will be shown, and it will come to an end in due course. And if we don't have a framework that identifies the primary suffering, the secondary suffering, the tertiary suffering, explains that the primary suffering is always an attitude to pleasure or pain, the secondary suffering is an attitude to the primary suffering, the tertiary suffering is an attitude to the secondary suffering. If that's not explained, and it might not be understood when I just said it now, it might be, what's he talking about? But as we hear it time and time again, and we start to observe in our own life these different movements, it all starts to become clear. Thank you.